And even our friend Chichikov at that moment was experiencing dreams that weren't completely down to earth. Let's see what he was feeling. At first, nothing much. He kept looking back to make sure that he was well out of the town. But when he felt sure that the town was out of sight, with its smithies and mills and all the things that surround towns, and that even the white tops of the stone churches had long since sunk into the ground, he concentrated exclusively on the road, looking right and left, as though the town he'd left no longer existed even in memory, as though he'd driven through it once very long ago, far back in his childhood. Then, the road itself ceased to interest him, and he started closing his eyes slightly, his head dipping toward the pillow. And I'm rather pleased at this, for it will give me an opportunity to speak about my hero. Thus far, I've always been prevented from doing so, sometimes by Nosdruf, sometimes by balls, ladies, town gossip, and the thousands of details that appear as details only when they are introduced into a narrative, but are considered very important matters when they actually occur. But now I'll postpone everything else and get down to business. It is doubtful whether the hero of our choice will please the reader. For one thing, the ladies won't take to him. No doubts there. Ladies like heroes to be absolutely perfect. The slightest spiritual or physical flaw, and he's no good. Even if the author searches deeply into the hero's soul and succeeds in reflecting it more clearly than a mirror, his efforts will not be appreciated. Chichikov's bulk and his age will weigh heavily against him. Excess fat, in any case, is never forgiven a hero. And many ladies will turn away with the words, "Phew! Isn't he disgusting?" Alas, I'm aware of all this, but still, after all's been said, I still can't choose a virtuous man as my hero. Yet, who knows, perhaps in this very narrative, chords until now unplayed will resound. Chords that will convey the infinite wealth of the Russian spirit. And perhaps there'll emerge a man endowed with supernatural virtues, or a divine Russian maiden unequaled in the world in the spiritual beauty of her feminine soul, filled to the brim with generosity and abnegation. And the virtuous people of all other tribes will appear dead to us, as a book is dead compared to the living word. So I haven't chosen a man of virtue for my hero, and I can explain why. The poor, virtuous man must be given a well-earned rest, because the very phrase, virtuous man, is beginning to sound shallow on people's lips, because the virtuous man has been turned into a sort of horse, and there's no author who hasn't ridden him, urging him on with his whip or whatever comes to hand. And so, they've exhausted the virtuous man. There's not even a trace of virtue left in him. And indeed, he has nothing left but skin and ribs. And all this because they've used the virtuous man hypocritically, because they don't respect him. Now I feel the time has come to make use of a rogue. So let's harness him for a change. Our hero's origins were humble and obscure. His parents came from the lesser gentry. But whether they themselves had been members of it, or whether their parents before them had been, is not known. Physically, he didn't resemble them, or at least a relative who assisted at his birth, a short woman of the species that is usually nicknamed Pugface, took him into her arms on that occasion and cried out aloud, "He's not at all the way I expected him to be. He ought to have taken after his grandma on his mama's side. That would have been best for him. But he looks, as the saying goes, not like Mum and even less like Dad, but a lot like a passing lad." At first, life gave him a sour, unfriendly look through a window half blocked with snow. During his childhood, he hadn't a friend or even a playmate. A small room with little windows that were never opened, winter or summer. The father, an ailing man in a long lamb's wool-lined coat, with knitted slippers on his sockless feet, eternally sighing, pacing the room, and making use of the spittoon, which stood in a corner. The endless sitting on a bench, pen in hand and ink on fingers and even on lips. The eternal injunctions: do not lie, obey your elders, carry virtue in your heart. The everlasting flapping and shuffling of his father's slippers, and the familiar but always severe paternal voice saying, "Here, he's being stupid again," every time the child, bored by the monotony of labor, added a wiggle or a little tail to a letter. This was usually followed by the very unpleasant sensation of the lobe of his ear being tweaked under the nails of long fingers that caught it from behind. This is the picture of his early childhood, of which he had retained only a bleached memory. But in life, everything changes suddenly and quickly one day in early spring when the sun was shining and the melting streams were stirring. The father set out with him in the little cart drawn by a ginger, piebald nag and driven by their hunchback coachman, the only progenitor of all the serfs owned by Chichikov's father, who performed almost all the functions of the household. For a couple of days they trundled along, sleeping on the road, crossing rivers, feeding on cold pie and roast mutton, until finally, on the morning, on the third day, they reached the town. The little boy stared, gaping at the magnificent city streets. Then nag and cart plunged suddenly into a muddy ditch, which marked the entrance of an alley into which they turned. It ran uphill, and the mud was so deep that the ginger piebald nag had to make a great effort, churning the mud with his spindly legs, as the hunchback and the master himself prodded him on, until it pulled them out into a small courtyard situated at the top of the slope. 2 apple trees in bloom faced an old ramshackle house, with a back garden containing nothing but elder and rowanberry bushes, under which a little wooden shack with a small opaque window was concealed. This house was inhabited by an old relative of theirs, a very ancient lady who nevertheless still went to the market every morning, after which she hung her stockings up to dry by the samovar. She now patted the boy on the cheek and admired his plumpness. He was to be left here to attend daily the classes at the town school. The father stayed overnight and left on the following morning. During the parting, no tears rolled from the parental eyes. The child was given half a ruble in coppers for expenses and candy, and, what was much more important, wise counsel. "Now remember, Pavel, study. Don't fool around, don't misbehave. And most important of all, always try to please your teachers and your superiors. If you succeed in pleasing your superiors, then even if you fail in learning, and even if God hasn't granted you much talent, you'll get along fine and even get ahead of others. Don't try to form close friendships with your schoolmates. You've nothing good to learn from them. But if you must make friends, then at least pick the richer ones who, on some occasion or other, might be useful to you. Do not pay for anyone. do not treat them. Instead, try to behave in such a way that people will treat you, because above all, you should hold on to your money. It's the most reliable thing there is in this world. A friend and a comrade is likely to betray you, or at least let you down when you're in distress, while money will never let you down, whatever your trouble. Money will do everything for you. It'll break down all obstacles in your way. After lecturing his son thus, the father climbed into the cart and trundled back home with the ginger, piebald nag. They never saw each other again. But these admonitions sank deep into the child's mind. Young Pavel Chichikov began to attend classes on the very next day. He didn't display any special aptitude for any particular subject. But he was hard-working and tidy and was very clever in a practical sense. He soon realized how to get along in life. He managed often to be treated by his comrades while never treating them, even on occasion storing away their treats and reselling them to the very persons who had given them to him. While still a child, he knew how to deny himself everything. Of the half-ruble his father had left him, he never spent a kopeck. On the contrary, at the end of the year, his holdings had increased. He also displayed rather unusual dexterity. He molded a goldfinch out of wax, painted it, and sold it quite profitably. Then for a while he went in for the following kind of transaction. He would buy some edibles in the market, sit near one of the more affluent boys in the class, and as soon as he sensed that his neighbor was working up an appetite, he would produce from under the desk, as though by chance, a square of gingerbread or a donut. And when the boy was sufficiently exasperated, he charged him according to the degree of his impatience. For 2 months, he worked tirelessly at home over a mouse imprisoned in a little wooden cage, until he had taught it to stand on its hind legs and to lie down when ordered. Then he sold it at a very good price. When his savings amounted to 5 rubles, he sewed them up in a little bag and started saving anew. He was even more clever in his relations with his superiors. No other boy could sit as quietly at his desk. It must be noted that his teacher was a great lover of silence and good behavior on the part of his pupils, and could not stand bright, clever boys whom he always suspected of laughing at him. Once a boy had been in trouble for an unsolicited witticism. He had only to twitch or raise an eyebrow to provoke the teacher's ire. He was mercilessly kicked out of class and punished. "I'll take the impertinence out of you, boy. I'll teach you how to obey," the teacher would shout. "I see through you, you know. Well then, get down on your knees in the corner for an hour or so. And you'll go without dinner, too, to round it off." And the poor child wore out his knees and went hungry without having any idea what he had done to deserve it. "Aptitudes, gifts, that's all garbage," the teacher would say. "What interests me is good behavior and nothing else. I'll give top marks to a boy who doesn't even know his ABCs if his behavior is irreproachable. And if a child is full of sarcasm and has a foul spirit, I'll flunk him even if he'd make King Solomon look an ignoramus." Thus spoke the teacher who hated Krylov for having written in one of his fables, "I don't care if drink's your quirk, if you really know your work." He liked to tell them, a self-satisfied expression on his face and his eyes sparkling with pleasure, that in the school he'd taught in before, there had been such silence in his classes that one could hear the flutter of flies' wings. That during a whole year, not one of his students had coughed or blown his nose during class, and that if one closed one's eyes, it was impossible to tell, before the final bell, whether the room was full or empty. Chichikov understood the mentality of those in authority and the proper way to behave. In class, he wouldn't blink an eyelid or move an eyebrow, even when he was mercilessly pinched from behind. When the bell rang, he'd be the first to jump up and he'd hand the teacher his three-cornered hat. This done, he'd rush out, and during recreation, he'd manage to cross the teacher's path at least 3 times, each time taking off his cap. This stratagem was fully successful. During his entire stay at the school, he had excellent marks, and on leaving, he passed every subject, receiving a diploma and a book on which was inscribed in gold letters, "For exemplary industriousness and excellent behavior."